In February of 2018, West Virginia experienced a historic display of organized labor power. Public school teachers, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, school nurses, and others went on strike, protesting low pay and cuts to health care. It began with walkouts at schools in a few counties, including Logan and Mingo counties. By February 22nd, however, it had spread to all 55 counties in the state, with around 35,000 workers taking part. Each day, the teachers and their supporters staged demonstrations at the state capitol building. This strike, which was illegal in West Virginia, ended with the teachers and other school staff winning 5% raises, not just for themselves, but for all state employees. This inspiring victory set off a wave of similar teacher strikes and protests across the United States. During the original strike, a lot of the teachers and other workers wore red bandanas on the picket lines, at demonstrations, and at the Capitol building. These pieces of red cloth hold a special significance in West Virginia, which has a rich history of labor militancy. Almost a century earlier, a different group of striking West Virginia workers wore red bandanas. In August of 1921, thousands of armed men marched across West Virginia coal country. They were Union miners, and they were marching to demand basic rights and freedom for them and their comrades. Their enemies called them rednecks. When I say redneck, I can probably guess the image that pops into your mind.
Get her done! Thanks a lot, y'all!
You done taken a wrong turn.
Yeah, like tuh, matey, but without the tuh.
My idea of happiness is killing things. So duck blinds are a big thing with me.
I've been watching NASCAR and drinking beer. That's your favorite sport. Yeah, NASCAR is too.
But in the early 1900s, this term came to mean something different entirely. In Appalachia, a series of labor strikes and uprisings known as the Coal Wars led to violent confrontations which ended in a literal battle. Hundreds of people would lose their lives in these conflicts. Martial law would be declared multiple times, and political dissent would be violently repressed. But there would also be remarkable instances of interracial organizing and cooperation, and the red handkerchief would come to symbolize resistance and class solidarity, playing a part in the largest civil insurrection the U.S. had seen since the Civil War. If you are a working class bitch like me, I want you right now to think of your boss. Imagine if your boss owned your home. What if they also owned the grocery store where you buy your food, the church you go to with your family, and the school where you send your kids? What if they had the final say over what was preached in that church and taught in that school? Imagine if they had complete control over your town's police department, if they controlled who could and could not enter your community. And imagine if they paid you in monopoly money. If you were a coal miner or the spouse or child of one in West Virginia around the turn of the century, this was likely your reality, because odds were you lived in a company town. Company towns were mining communities created and owned entirely by coal companies to house their employees. They were unincorporated, had no elected officials, and were often isolated from the outside world. To put it mildly, these were not fun places to live. Miners and their families paid to live in company housing, which usually meant small, cheaply made, uninsulated cabins. Mine owners could evict you at any time for any reason, and the law allowed them to inspect your home without a warrant. Most of these towns at the time lacked basic sanitation, indoor plumbing, and electricity. They were also missing a lot of the other niceties of regular incorporated towns. But one thing every company town was guaranteed to have was a colliery tipple, which is a structure used to load coal into railroad cars for transport. Residents were exposed to a tremendous amount of pollution. The creeks and streams that flowed nearby were polluted with mine runoff, manure, human waste from outhouses, and this provided perfect conditions for diseases like dysentery and smallpox. As James Green writes in The Devil is Here in These Hills, West Virginia's coal miners and their battle for freedom, the air was polluted with smoke from locomotive engines and smoldering refuse dumps, as well as choking gas from superheated coke ovens. Not that kind of coke, a kind of fuel made from coal used in the production of steel. Cinders from the locomotive boilers fell like rain over the miners' houses, and coal dust from the mine tipples seeped under every door and through every crack, clinging to the miners' clothes and the laundry their wives hung out every day. Coal dust peppered people's food, coated their vegetable plants, and entered their lungs with every breath they took. It was as if the company was marking you as its property, never letting you for a second forget where you were and what your station in life was. Coal operators seemingly controlled almost every aspect of life in company towns, and speech was tightly restricted. The company selected the teachers who would instruct the miners' children, the ministers who would preach to them and their families, and of course the manager of the company store. Even the postmaster was a company official and would routinely go through people's mail. They controlled who you contacted, what you said, and did not allow any subversive literature. Law enforcement was mainly performed by private guards who first and foremost served the company. In southern West Virginia, the primary supplier of these guards was the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. The Baldwin-Felts agents were responsible for protecting company property, preventing any outside merchants or peddlers from coming in and selling their wares, keeping a close watch on the miners, and, perhaps most importantly, stopping any outside agitators, aka union organizers, from making their way into town. The mine guard system allowed coal operators to maintain tight control over the lives of workers and their families. Instead of US dollars, coal company employees were paid in what was called company scrip, currency that was only good at the company store. For the most part, the mine owners did not allow any independently run businesses, so you had no choice but to patronize company businesses for your basic goods and necessities. And this meant they could charge whatever exorbitant prices they wanted. Miners received a wage for every ton of coal they dug. However, the person responsible for weighing the coal, known as the check weighman, was almost always a coal company official who could short the miners on their pay. On top of this, coal operators would sometimes declare that instead of digging a regular ton, 2,000 pounds, miners had to dig what was called a long ton, or 2,200 pounds, to get their full pay. Working conditions in West Virginian coal mines were incredibly dangerous, and safety laws were rarely, if ever, enforced. In fact, West Virginia had a higher death rate for coal mining than any other state in the first decade of the 20th century. There was the ever-present danger of noxious gases known as damps that could build up and cause asphyxiation or explosions. On top of this, there were, of course, the long-term health impacts of regularly inhaling coal dust, such as black lung disease. Booker T. Washington, the famous African-American educator, author, and activist, had worked in the mines of the Kanawha New River coal field as a boy. In his autobiography, he wrote of the experience, "Work in the coal mines I always dreaded. There was always the danger of being blown to pieces by a premature explosion of powder or of being crushed by falling slate. Accidents from one or other of these causes were frequently occurring, and this kept me in constant fear." There was a decidedly callous attitude on the part of mine owners, politicians, and other elites towards the dangers miners face every day. In 1901, the governor of West Virginia at the time, G.W. Atkinson, remarked, "It is but the natural course of mining events that men should be injured and killed by accidents." On December 6, 1907, a devastating explosion occurred at the Monongah Mine in West Virginia, causing the deaths of around 400 people. This was the worst mining accident in U.S. history. Upon learning of this tragedy, one mine foreman's first thought was to ask how many mules had been killed, because it cost more to replace a mule than it did to replace a worker. This entire system was clearly oppressive for all workers. However, people of color, as with many things, really received the brunt of it. Black miners were given the more dangerous underground jobs at a higher rate than American-born whites and white immigrants, and they often worked in the worst areas of the mine. This could mean areas with poor air circulation, areas with the most water and rock, which meant the miner had to do a lot of unpaid labor of clearing the rock before they could even start loading coal. And it could mean working in an area with a low coal seam, which meant you had to work on your knees, which was incredibly uncomfortable. When black workers were given outside, above-ground jobs, they were more often than not the least desirable and most dangerous ones, like jobs in the coke yards, which were incredibly hot and strenuous, or as brakemen, which was the most hazardous position working on coal cars. Discriminatory state legislation blocked workers of color from attaining better positions, and it also prevented them from attending schools where they could learn skilled jobs. In order to just survive in a white supremacist society, many African American workers felt the need to be twice as efficient and productive as their white counterparts, and in many cases they succeeded. Many white workers viewed workers of color as a competitive threat. Some groups even went on strike to protest African Americans being hired. Violence was also not uncommon. As Joe William Trotter Jr. writes in Coal, Class, and Color, Blacks in Southern West Virginia, 1915-32, like whites, most blacks entered the mines as manual coal loaders. However, the effects of racial inequality compounded the exploitative impact of the class system blacks experienced. White workers often resisted the hiring of blacks, claiming that it is a class of labor that meets the approval of the operators here, because they are used to low wages. In several violent incidents between 1890 and 1910, whites attempted to drive blacks out of Mercer County. Another form of white violence, lynchings, also increased, reaching a peak of 12 in 1896. Coal operators seized upon and used this racism to their advantage, as it served their interests perfectly. In Rednecks and Red Bandanas, Appalachian Coal Miners, and the Coloring of Union Identity, Patrick Huber quotes one coal operator in 1933. We get the best results where one class of miners is looked down upon by the others and try to get advantage of the other class in the way of good places and responsible positions which pay more money. As many of you may be aware, this is a painfully common theme in the history of American capitalism. Well, I'm sure capitalism in general, but definitely American capitalism. You see, coal companies, much like employers today, wanted to sow as much division among their employees as possible to keep them from unionizing, and they used different tactics to do this. At the turn of the century, the coal industry was growing rapidly, spurred by the construction of railroads and the industrialization of America. Needing more workers to meet increased demand for coal, companies hired many black workers from the American South, as well as European immigrants, a good number of them from Italy, Poland, and Hungary. This was not the coal companies doing DEI. It was done partly to lower costs. As James Green writes, during the early 1900s, employers hired far more African Americans and European immigrants than white Americans, hoping these new laborers would be more compliant and productive than the gnarly mountaineers, aka the native-born Appalachians. But this was also done to ensure a divided workforce. The miners' housing in coal towns was racially segregated, with separate sections for native-born whites, European immigrants, and African Americans. This was a powerful way of keeping these groups atomized and prejudiced towards each other. Hiring black miners as strikebreakers was another tactic to do this. When workers go on strike, employers often bring in temporary outside workers to fill in the gaps. These are known as strikebreakers, or derogatorily as scabs. Coal operators frequently brought in African Americans as strikebreakers, and this only served to increase bitterness and resentment among the different groups. For white miners, this reinforced in their minds the idea that black people were a threat and wanted to steal their jobs. Racism made white miners identify more with their employer, the person exploiting them, than with their black coworkers. So, these were the West Virginia coal fields at the turn of the century. Workers were divided and splintered, they lived and worked in miserable conditions, and the coal companies had almost total control. Resistance seemed to be futile. However, a monumental upheaval was on the horizon. But first, a detour. The largest labor union for miners in the US at the time was the United Mine Workers of America, and it still is, by the way. At the turn of the century, the leaders of this union thought the West Virginia coal fields, in terms of organizing, were a lost cause. And they weren't alone in seeing the region this way. For the rest of the country, Appalachia as a whole was a hopelessly backwards and primitive place. It was spoken of as the other America, and Appalachian people were seen as uniquely regressive, violent, and uneducated. A 1921 editorial in the New York Times declared them often good-natured folk, simple, religious, or at least given to religious observances, a little careless with firearms, but save for their primitive ferocities, probably not essentially worse than most other people. In What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia, Elizabeth Catt, an Appalachian historian, explains how the people of this vast region were, in the public's imagination, transformed into this homogeneous group, stuck in the past and isolated from progress. This picture is something that in many ways continues to this day. Appalachians are spoken of in the media and by politicians as tragic religious hillbillies, a group to be pitied and lamented, while at the same time condemned as ignorant, reactionary, and racist. Catt writes, "According to the bulk of coverage about the region, I do not exist. My partner does not exist. Our families do not exist. Other individuals who do not exist include all non-white people, anyone with progressive politics, those who care about the environment, LGBTQ individuals, young folks, and a host of others. The intentional omission of these voices fits a long tradition of casting Appalachia as a monolithic other America. It might be true that much of the region is overwhelmingly white, but it is also true that there are few towns or cities in Appalachia without a visible African American or Latino community. Constructions of the region as all white to satisfy a particular fetish about the white working class maliciously erase individuals whose lives also matter." Coal miners and Appalachians have long been cast as helpless, tragic representations of the white working class, waiting on a hero to save them. And certain politicians have been more than happy to step in and play that role.
We are going to put our coal miners back to work. They have not been treated well, but they're going to be treated well now.
Our amazing coal miners. Thank you very much, fellas. That's great. And I know you well. I know you well. I think I get about 97% of your vote. You're special people. You got mistreated very badly for a long period of time. But you've never had a better friend in the Oval Office than me.
Usually out of cynical opportunism rather than genuine concern.
This morning, 100 days into President Trump's second term, and these 8 retired miners, all who say they have black lung disease, and most of whom voted for the president, now with a plea for help.
There is no block of coal worth any man's life or woman's.
Many here concerned after 10,000 recent firings at the Department of Health and Human Services virtually eliminated the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, tasked with protecting miners from black lung. And the enforcement of a new federal rule cracking down on dangerous rock dust directly tied to the disease also now paused. Vital free x-rays and protections for sick miners now abruptly halted, even as doctors in Appalachia are finding black lung is making a brutal resurgence, impacting younger and younger miners.
This guy is 30 years old?
This guy's already passed away. I understand cutting waste in government, but this is not something to cut. This is essential for the health and well-being of the people that helped elect you.
In the past, another group that has loved to exploit all these narratives about the region have, funnily and horrifyingly enough, been race scientists and eugenicists. This idea of Appalachians being a distinct race, all of Scots-Irish descent, fit their purposes wonderfully. Charles Davenport, a pseudoscientist and the director of the Eugenics Record Office, a real thing that existed in Cold Spring Harbor, New York between 1910 and 1939, declared that Virginia's mountaineers possessed genetically a combination of the worst traits, a badly put together people. For this inferior white race, the eugenicists cast themselves as the saviors who were going to swoop in and rescue them with institutionalization and forced sterilization programs. I'm not going to go too much deeper into this here because that's just a whole other depressing can of worms, but if you would like to learn more, a good place to start is perhaps with Carrie Buck. She was a Virginia woman who was institutionalized for being feeble-minded, an incredibly vague term which was used as a real medical and legal diagnosis at the time and could literally be applied to anyone who deviated ever so slightly from the norms of society. Due to this charge of feeble-mindedness, in 1927, Carrie Buck became the first person to be involuntarily sterilized under Virginia's eugenics laws. Around 8,300 other people were forcefully sterilized under these laws, which remained on the books in Virginia until 1974. And this was just in Virginia. Tens of thousands of people were sterilized under eugenics laws throughout the United States. So, the race scientists treated this group they deemed genetically inferior, similarly to how they treated non-white people. And they kind of used it as cover for their racism. Now they could say, look, we dehumanize white people too. We're not racist. We sterilize everyone equally, as long as they're poor. One final class of people who benefited from the invention of the Appalachian as a distinct other was the industrialists. The narrative that primitive mountaineers were living in the past and needed to be developed went hand in hand with the desire to extract profit from them. The argument went that these people were helpless and lawless and they needed someone, a kind-hearted, mine-owning capitalist perhaps, to step in and generously give them a job, to give their lives the structure and order of modern industry, you see. Only then could they be civilized. Which brings us nicely, and not awkwardly at all, back from our little detour to the First Coal War. So, the United Mine Workers of America had written off West Virginia coal miners, an entire swath of workers it deemed a waste of time to try to organize. Until, that is, a new figure was brought into the fold. In 1898, UMWA President John Mitchell hired a new full-time organizer named Mary Harris Jones. A notorious agitator and hellraiser, she was known to most people as Mother Jones. She was a woman whose life was completely upended multiple times. As a teen, her family was driven out of Ireland by the Great Famine. Growing up in Toronto, Canada, she learned dressmaking and trained to be a school teacher. After moving to the U.S., she married a union foundry worker named George Jones, with whom she had 4 children. In 1867, George and their 4 children all died in a yellow fever epidemic. She then relocated to Chicago and started a dressmaking business, only to have it burned down in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It was after this, when she was in her 40s, that she began attending Knights of Labor meetings and eventually devoted her life to the labor movement. She took part in and led hundreds of workers' strikes and demonstrations across the United States, in industries ranging from garment making to brewing to mining. She was known for her rousing anti-capitalist speeches, and everywhere she went, she tirelessly advocated for the rights of workers. Her work fighting for American miners earned her the nickname the Miner's Angel. Jones disagreed with the UMWA officials who had given up on West Virginia. In 1901, she journeyed there to convince the miners to join the Union. It's difficult to overstate the tenacity of this woman. When she walked into these coal camps at around 65 years of age, mine guards threatened her and brandished guns in her face. She was undaunted. She was, to put it in technical terms, a bad bitch. Jones spent months traveling from town to town, speaking to the miners. In 1902, a strike broke out in West Virginia in solidarity with a strike that started in Pennsylvania. The largest coal operator in southern West Virginia, Justice Collins, hired 40 Baldwin Felts agents to break the strike. During this period, Mother Jones witnessed firsthand the brutality of the mine guard system. In February of 1903, a posse of law enforcement and Baldwin Felts agents raided a miners' village that had held a Union rally. Mother Jones went to the scene and witnessed the aftermath. She described it in her autobiography. "Everything was deathly still. As I came near the miners' homes, I could hear sobbing. Then I saw between the stilts that propped up a miner's shack the clay red with blood. I pushed open the door. On a mattress, wet with blood, lay a miner. His brains had been blown out while he slept. His shack was riddled with bullets. In 5 other shacks, men lay dead. In one of them, a baby boy and his mother sobbed over the father's corpse. When the little fellow saw me, he said, 'Mother Jones, bring back my papa to me. I want to kiss him.' The coroner came. He found that these 6 men had been murdered in their beds while they peacefully slept, shot by gunmen in the employ of the coal company. The coroner went. The men were buried on the mountainside, and nothing was ever done to punish the men who had taken their lives." This experience had a deeply profound impact on Jones and stayed with her for the rest of her life. She was arrested and charged with provoking an illegal work shutdown. The prosecutor at her trial famously called her the most dangerous woman in America. She was found guilty and ordered to get out of West Virginia or be incarcerated. In 1903, the Baldwin Felts agents succeeded in breaking the strike. The coal operators had won. For now. It was during this early visit to the coal fields that Jones met Frank Keeney, a 20-year-old miner who liked to spend his free time drinking and playing pool. He'd been working in mines since he was 9 years old when he began as a trapper boy. This job entailed sitting in the dark and opening and closing trap doors for coal carts. Trapper boys were typically very young children. The legal work age in West Virginia was 12, but coal operators regularly ignored state law. Mother Jones saw potential in the young Keeney and encouraged him to set aside his frivolous pastimes and educate himself so he could lead his fellow workers. He took her advice, and in the years to come, he read everything he could get his hands on. He really developed his political sensibility and eventually became a committed socialist. In 1912, thousands of miners on Paint Creek, a tributary of the Kanawha River in West Virginia, went on strike after coal operators refused to give them a modest pay raise. Shortly after, miners just across the ridge on nearby Cabin Creek decided to join them. This wildcat strike on Cabin Creek was led by none other than the now 29-year-old Frank Keeney, around a decade since he first met Mother Jones. The strikers' demands were to be able to trade at places other than the company store, that miners be allowed to employ their own check weighmen, that freedom of speech and assembly be guaranteed, that there be no more blacklisting of fired union miners, the end of the long ton system, official recognition of the union, and to get rid of the mine guards. The striking miners were fired, and they, along with their families, were evicted from company housing and moved into tent colonies on nearby non-company property. 300 Baldwin Felts agents set up machine guns around Cabin Creek. The mine owners brought in strikebreakers on armed trains. Miners and their wives would often be waiting to confront these scabs when they disembarked. The women, often armed with household appliances instead of guns, fought just as aggressively as the men to keep the strikebreakers from entering the mines. After all, the very survival of their families was at stake. In fact, women provided much of the support necessary for keeping the strike going, and this has been true in many labor conflicts. It's a point illustrated perfectly in the classic documentary Harlan County, USA, about a 1973 miners' strike in Kentucky. In the film, we see a group of women organizing and fighting like hell to sustain the strike and win a union contract for their husbands. We're introduced to Lois Scott, the de facto leader of this group, which, if you've never seen this movie, please watch it. This woman is an absolute legend.
Come on. It's loaded? Yeah. You shouldn't carry it with you like that.
Oh, it's got safety. And if it did, it wouldn't shoot nothing. Yeah, I might lose that one anyway. As long as I got enough.
I want you to meet the needle, Lois.
Oh, tell them I started out with a switch on that picket line, but I'm ended up now carrying a gun.
Sarah Blizzard was a labor activist who became something of a legend herself. During the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, she allowed evicted miners to camp on her land and joined Mother Jones in a women's march in support of the union. In the coal fields, she was known as Mother or Ma Blizzard. African Americans were fully immersed in the strike and showed up alongside everyone else to confront the strikebreakers. One prominent activist was Dan Chain, also known as Few Clothes Johnson, a fierce UMWA organizer who took part in armed resistance against the coal companies. This multiracial group of miners were not cooperating because they were anti-racist or woke or anything. This was 1912, after all. I mean, I guess some of them could have been anti-racist, I don't know. But that wasn't the main point. The point was, they recognized they had a common interest in setting aside their differences and standing together. They knew that in order to win against their employer, they would need everyone. There was also something about working in the mines that seemed to foster solidarity. When you went underground with a group of people, in a situation where you could all lose your lives at any moment and where you depended on each other, it bonded you to a certain extent. And of course, down in the dark mines with everyone covered in coal dust, you couldn't tell what the color of anyone's skin was. It also helped that, unlike many unions at the time, the UMWA banned discrimination in its constitution, held integrated meetings, and elected people of color to union offices. Despite these policies, however, this wasn't some perfect, racially harmonious movement. There were complaints from black miners that they weren't being treated equally in the union, and white UMW members sometimes resisted black leadership. Even considering these pitfalls, though, interracial organizing was still important in the lives of these workers. Around this time, at the beginning of the strike, the UMWA was directing the bulk of its support to the strike on Paint Creek. Frank Keeney traveled to the union office in Charleston, the state capital, to seek further assistance. UMW officials told him he was out of luck, giving the excuse that they didn't have the funds. Desperate, Keeney went to Mother Jones, who was staying in a hotel in Charleston. She immediately agreed to help him. Jones went to Keeney's hometown of Eskdale, the only non-company town in Cabin Creek. Before a large crowd, she gave a fiery speech that inspired even more miners to walk off the job. She wasn't afraid to shame workers into joining the union and often tapped into their sense of manhood to spur them to action. In one speech around this time, she said to the miners, "And you are a lot of dirty cowards. I want to tell you the truth about it. You are a lot of cowards, and you haven't got enough marrow in your backbone to grease two black cats' tails. If you were men with a bit of revolutionary blood in you, you wouldn't stand for the Baldwin Guards, would you?" A week after the Eskdale speech, Jones led a march of 3,000 people to the State House in Charleston and demanded that Governor William Glasscock remove the Baldwin-Felts agents and end the mine guard system. She declared, "The governor will get until tomorrow night, Friday night, to get rid of his bloodhounds, and if they are not gone, we will get rid of them." When their demands went ignored, the miners began to arm themselves and organize into groups that could protect their encampments. They dynamited railroads and coal tipples and shot at trains. Their goals with this violence were to halt coal production and kill mine guards. Governor Glasscock responded by declaring martial law in Paint Creek and Cabin Creek and sent in 1,200 National Guardsmen. The purpose of the National Guard going in was supposedly to restore order, but in reality, it was to crush the strike. The National Guardsmen confiscated thousands of guns from the miners. They arrested strikers, union activists, and people suspected of being socialists. Among them was Mother Jones, who was tried by a military tribunal and sentenced to 20 years in prison. On having the choice of leaving West Virginia or going to jail, Jones told one journalist, "I choose jail now. I can raise just as much hell in jail as anywhere." Jones's sentence received national attention, and there were public appeals for her release. Her imprisonment also brought the attention of the U.S. Senate to the situation in West Virginia, which we'll come back to later. People had already been killed on both sides of this conflict, including 11 miners. But one violent incident was about to cause a greater commotion than any of them. On February 7, 1913, a Paint Creek coal operator named Quinn Morton and a group of Baldwin-Felts agents were shot at by striking miners. No one was hurt in this attack, but Morton was absolutely incensed and wanted revenge. He sought the help of Kanawha County Sheriff Bonner Hill in Charleston. That night, Morton, Sheriff Hill, and a posse of armed men boarded an armored train known as the Bull Moose Special. The name came from one of the nicknames for Theodore Roosevelt when he was running for a third term as president. They rode this death train, which had been retrofitted with steel armor and equipped with a Gatling gun, up to the miners' camp at Holly Grove, which they had determined was where the shooters came from. They killed the train's lights, rolled past the camp, and opened fire with rifles and the machine gun. Francis Francesco Estep, sometimes shortened to Sesco Estep, was an Italian miner who lived with his family in a small cabin at the Holly Grove camp. Him and his wife, Maud, had one infant child, and she was pregnant with another. The night of February 7th, they were together in their front room when their home was riddled with machine gun bullets. Francesco was attempting to get Maud and the baby to safety in the cellar when he was struck in the face and killed instantly. The murder of Sesco Estep greatly angered the striking miners and garnered them significant public sympathy and outrage. Allegedly, after this attack, Sarah Blizzard led a group of women in ripping up the railroad tracks to prevent the Bull Moose Special from returning to Holly Grove. Henry Hatfield, who was the nephew of Devil Anse Hatfield of the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud, was West Virginia's newly elected governor. Facing significant public pressure to release Mother Jones and now public fury over this latest killing, he came up with a deal to end the strike. In April 1913, he presented to the miners and coal operators what became known as the Hatfield Agreement, which was drafted with no input from the miners themselves and included the following: a 9-hour workday, the ability to trade at independent stores, the right to select check weighmen, the establishment of a grievance procedure, and the freedom of union organizers to enter company towns. This deal, crucially, did not ban the blacklisting of strike leaders and did not include official recognition of the UMWA. The coal operators, unsurprisingly, readily accepted it. UMWA leadership, under intense pressure from Governor Hatfield, also signed on. Now this, officially, on paper, ended the strike. However, most rank-and-file miners opposed the Hatfield contract as insufficient and saw this as union leaders selling them out. The governor issued an ultimatum that if miners did not return to work, they would be deported from West Virginia by the National Guard. This only served to infuriate the holdouts. Frank Keeney and his confidant, Fred Mooney, led thousands of miners in a series of wildcat strikes on Cabin Creek. Henry Hatfield believed the opposition to his deal could only be explained by socialist propaganda. And so, he went after two southern West Virginia leftist newspapers, the Labor Argus and the Socialist and Labor Star, ordering their printing presses confiscated, their offices ransacked, and their editors arrested. These actions earned Hatfield intense condemnation in the media. Facing mounting pressure, the governor ordered the release of Mother Jones from military custody on May 7th. As I said earlier, her imprisonment, which lasted nearly 3 months, had caught the attention of the United States Senate. This led to a Senate subcommittee, headed by Republican Senator William Squire Kenyon, launching an investigation into the conflict on Paint Creek and Cabin Creek. Its findings looked very bad for the coal companies. 6 weeks after this subcommittee adjourned, and with the wildcat strikes ongoing, the Cabin Creek mine owners finally capitulated to Frank Keeney and his holdouts. They agreed not to fire or blacklist strike leaders and promised to follow the ruling of a government-appointed arbitration board. Also, the armed mine guards would be removed from Paint Creek and Cabin Creek. However, crucially, they did not agree to officially recognize the Union. It was July of 1913, and the First Coal War was finally over. It had lasted over a year and claimed the lives of 10 guards and 12 miners. In the aftermath of this strike, Keeney and Mooney launched an insurgent campaign and were elected president and secretary-treasurer, respectively, of District 17 of the United Mine Workers. This signaled a radical and militant turn in the Union. Now we're going to fast forward about 7 years. During that time, a minor tussle you may have heard of called the First World War happened. During World War I, things were more or less quiet in the coal fields in terms of labor disputes. First of all, many of the miners went off to fight. Secondly, Frank Keeney told his miners not to strike for the duration of the conflict. The mainstream sentiment was that America was fighting to make the world safe for democracy, and so organized labor should just keep its head down and support the war effort. On the heels of its success with the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, and with the new leadership of Keeney and Mooney generating enthusiasm, District 17 increased its membership significantly during the war to 30,000. The Union also had a surplus of cash. With these newfound gains, UMWA President John Lewis announced they were going to unionize every mine in West Virginia. Keeney and Mooney were determined to organize two counties in particular that had long been anti-union strongholds, Logan and Mingo counties. You may recall me mentioning them at the beginning as the two counties that started the teachers' strike. Logan County, which stood like a buffer between Union territory and non-Union Mingo County, was under the close watch of Sheriff Don Chafin. Notorious for his brutality and corruption, Chafin was in the pocket of the coal companies, making $50,000 a year in kickbacks from the Logan County Coal Operators Association. Chafin had a posse of 46 men who patrolled Logan County on the lookout for troublemakers. In 1919, Mother Jones sent 2 organizers to Logan County. Chafin discovered them and took them to Blair Mountain Ridge, where he was going to kill them on the spot. Thankfully, one of his deputies intervened and convinced him to only beat them up. Once, Chafin's deputies assaulted a state government official because they mistook him for a troublemaker. Another time, they pistol-whipped a reverend named Alfred Eubanks, whose crime was speaking positively of the United Mine Workers at a prayer meeting. Chafin once threatened an African-American miner named Luther Mills to spy on his fellow workers, telling him if he disagreed, he would be a dead N-word. Mills, thankfully, escaped Logan County. Ever since the Union had demonstrated its power in the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike, coal companies were scared. In Mingo County and elsewhere in the West Virginia fields, they began using improvements in the living conditions of their company towns to stave off the Union threat. This included things like improved housing, health, and recreation, as well as building more schools and churches. This particular brand of what is called welfare capitalism was presented in a very paternalistic way. It attempted to make the miners see coal operators as benevolent father figures who generously took care of their workers. One Southern West Virginia newspaper described a company manager as a father to every man, woman, and child on his work. Another columnist wrote of a different coal operator, "On the winding gulf, the men say that Mr. Tams is the working man's daddy." This messaging was particularly targeted at African American workers who were told that the company would take better care of them than the union would. As William Trotter Jr. writes, "The relationship between blacks and coal operators, although based upon the interplay of concrete class and racial interests, was mediated through the increasingly common rhetoric of welfare capitalism, conditioned by the operators' paternalistic and racist notions of black dependency, in exchange for employment, housing, credit at the company store, and a gradually expanding variety of recreational and social welfare programs. Employers expected deference from all workers, but especially from blacks." The coal company's main motive in adopting these reforms was to prevent working class unity and keep the miners subservient. Green writes, "Besides appealing to public opinion, coal town reforms were intended to place total authority in the hands of management, to remold the personality of the industrial worker, and to prevent him from becoming class conscious and from organizing trade unions." Now, in Mingo County, this only worked for so long, and in the spring of 1920, a group of Mingo County miners went to Frank Keeney's Charleston office and asked him for help in unionizing their mine. Keeney dispatched a team of organizers to Matewan, which was an independent town. They held a union rally there, and 300 miners signed up to join the UMW, with hundreds more following suit the next day. This prompted the coal operators to order their employees to sign yellow dog contracts. A yellow dog contract is a pledge saying that as a condition of your employment, you will never join a union. It was a fairly common occurrence for employers to force their workers to sign these. Despite this, the UMW organizers managed to sign up 3,000 of Mingo County's 4,000 miners to join the union. The chief of police of Matewan was a man named Sid Hatfield. He had previously been a coal miner and supported the union. Known as Smilin' Sid because of the gold caps he had on his upper teeth, he had a bit of a reputation for being a rough and formidable character. Like the governor, he was a descendant of the famous Hatfield clan and played up that family association to increase his notoriety. On May 19, 1920, Tom Feltz, the head of the Baldwin Feltz Detective Agency, sent a dozen agents to Matewan. Their mission was to evict miners and their families on behalf of the Stone Mountain Coal Company, due to the miners having tried to join the union. This group of agents include Tom Felt's brothers, Albert and Lee Feltz. When they arrived in Matewan, they were met by Sheriff Hatfield and Mayor Cabell Testerman, who challenged their authority to conduct evictions. The agents could not produce valid eviction notices, but went about their business anyways, throwing people and their belongings out of company houses on the outskirts of town. While the Baldwin-Felts men carried out these illegal evictions, Hatfield put out warrants for their arrest and deputized some local miners. When the agents returned to the center of town to catch the evening train, they were confronted once again by Hatfield and Testerman, who presented them with the arrest warrants. Albert Felts, conversely, insisted he had the right to arrest Hatfield. Tensions came to a head and a gunfight broke out. Albert and Lee Felts and Mayor Testerman were killed. 5 other Baldwin-Felts agents, as well as 2 unarmed miners, were also fatally shot. It is unclear who fired the first shot, but the evidence points to this being a planned attack on the part of Sid Hatfield. This incident, which became known as the Matewan Massacre, made Sid Hatfield into a hero for the miners, a savior who was finally standing up to their oppressors. The Matewan Massacre galvanized the Union movement in West Virginia, and the UMWA dispatched even more organizers to Mingo County. One of the new arrivals was C.E. Lively, a longtime Union activist who opened a restaurant in Matewan and offered to let the miners hold meetings there. On July 1st, 1920, Frank Keeney called for a general strike in Mingo County, and thousands of miners walked off the job. The coal companies immediately went back to the old reliable playbook from previous labor actions, firing the striking miners, evicting them and their families from company housing, and importing strikebreakers by train. The mine owners wanted to turn public opinion against the Union, and to do this, they used that other old reliable, the specter of communism. Well, old and reliable to us now. Back then it was kind of a new thing, I guess. This was happening in the context of the first Red Scare, the period from roughly 1917 to 1920, when there was widespread fear and hysteria about a communist takeover of America. It was in part a reaction to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which got many patriotic Americans, red, white, and blue, panties in a twist, thinking that the same thing might happen in the good old US of A. Now, anarchism and communism are different things, but to the general public, they were essentially one and the same. They were both associated with lawlessness. In the public imagination, the figure of the communist/anarchist was a crazed, unwashed, bomb-throwing agent of chaos. During this time, there were nationwide raids of suspected communist organizations led by U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. This was also a period of surging xenophobia and nationalism, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants were especially targeted. Thousands of alleged radicals were arrested, and hundreds of immigrants were deported, including the anarchist and stunning icon Emma Goldman. The coal operators tried to discredit Union activity by equating it with Bolshevism, a practice known as red baiting. They referred to Union miners and sympathizers as communists, anarchists, and Reds. Another epithet they used, somewhat interchangeably with these, was redneck. This was used as a slur by coal operators, company guards, non-union miners, and strikebreakers to denigrate the Union. Redneck being used like this is interesting because it seems so at odds with the meaning it has today. Where did this term come from, and how did it come to be associated with radical left-wing politics? The term redneck most likely originated in Great Britain in the 17th century with a group of devout Scottish Presbyterians known as the Covenanters. These very fun and good-humored Protestant zealots were staunchly opposed to interference by the Stuart kings in the affairs of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The Stuart kings, such as Charles I, saw themselves as the head of the church, rather than our boy JC, and sought to impose their royal will upon it. The Covenanters stubbornly defied the crown's religious laws and regulations, and for this they were severely persecuted. Many were imprisoned, tortured, and/or killed. A lot of places I saw online suggested that the Covenanters were called rednecks because they wore red bandanas as a sign of rebellion, and or because in 1643 some of them signed the Solemn League and Covenant in their own blood. However, I couldn't find a source to confirm this. I even read this whole book about the Covenanters, and there wasn't one mention of rednecks, bandanas, handkerchiefs, or signing things in blood. And it was really boring. One source I noticed was cited a lot in reference to this claim was the book Albion Seed, 4 British Folkways in America by David Hackett Fischer. I did find the following passage, but just a quick note before I read it. In this quote, Fischer refers to the back settlers. And by this, he's talking about people who emigrated from North Britain to the back country of America, which basically means Appalachia. Another term for this rural proletariat was redneck, which was originally applied to the back settlers because of their religion. The earliest American example was recorded in North Carolina by Anne Royal in 1830, who noted that redneck was a name bestowed upon the Presbyterians. It had long been a slang word for religious dissenters in the north of England. So here we have confirmation of this term originating with dissenting Presbyterians in Britain, but we're still not told why they came to have it bestowed upon them. The other explanation of where redneck comes from is one that you've probably heard before, that it comes from farmers having sunburnt necks from working in the fields. It's one I've heard most of my life, and turns out it's pretty much true. During Reconstruction in the Deep South, redneck was used to describe white farmers and sharecroppers when some of them refused to wear the same hats as black sharecroppers working next to them in the fields. After emancipation, an increasing number of black sharecroppers began wearing large wool hats while they worked to protect them from the sun. Some white sharecroppers then switched from their traditional hats to smaller ones that allowed their necks to get sunburned, all because they didn't want to be seen wearing the same thing as their formerly enslaved black co-workers. The term redneck became a shorthand for poor whiteness, used by both African Americans and the Southern elite. Redneck exists at this intersection of class and race. In the antebellum South, skin color signified both. A darker complexion, whether from your ancestry or from being out in the sun all the time, meant you were lower class. A fair complexion meant you didn't have to toil in the sun. You lived off the labor of others. In the coal fields of southern West Virginia, a lot of the coal miners were former sharecroppers and farmers, and a good number of them came from the Deep South. When the coal operators used this epithet against them, it kind of carried this double meaning of poor white southerner and filthy commie radical. And speaking of those low-down, filthy reds, on January 26, 1921, Sid Hatfield and some other defendants were put on trial for the killing of Baldwin Felts agents at Matewan. C.E. Lively, the restaurant owner and supposed Union diehard, took part in this trial, where he revealed himself to be an undercover Baldwin Felts agent. He testified against Hatfield and the others. Nevertheless, Hatfield and his fellow defendants were found not guilty and acquitted of the murder charges. In May of 1921, a series of violent incidents took place in Mingo County, which became known as the 3 Days War. Union men fought with state police and mine guards. They dynamited the company power plant, attacked Matewan, and fired on strikebreakers. Soon after this, Governor Ephraim Morgan declared martial law in Mingo County. Just like in the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, this led to many miners being arrested and jailed without charges. For example, some miners were thrown in jail for something as trivial as standing and talking in too large of a group. In June of that year, state troopers conducted a raid on a miners' tent colony. They ransacked the entire camp, cutting holes in tents, confiscating weapons, and killing one unarmed miner. They then marched away 45 strikers at gunpoint on no charges. By this time, over 100 Union men had been jailed under martial law in Mingo County. Frank Ingham was a longtime Mingo County miner. As an African-American Union man in the coal fields, he was no stranger to adversity. He had lost his job and his house more than once, was arrested several times, and was once beaten nearly to death by sheriff's deputies, all for his union activities. He knew the meaning of solidarity and resisted the mine owners' dividing of the working class along racial lines. He said of one occasion when he was fired, "The reason that he, the superintendent of the Howard Collieries Company in Chattaroy, Mingo County, gave for discharging me the last time was that all of the white men that had joined the Union, he had discharged them, and he said that he was going to put all of the colored fellows back to work. He told me to get out when I told the colored people not to take the white people's places." To black miners who had grown up in slavery or whose parents had, life in the West Virginia coalfields had always felt all too familiar. They saw the similarities between life under the thumb of the company and the mine guards and their former enslavement. One miner named George Eccles said, "I was raised a slave. My master and my mistress called me and I answered, and I know the time when I was a slave and I feel just like I feel now." These miners recognized that the company town system stripped workers of their freedom and rights, regardless of the color of their skin. And this recognition only fueled their commitment to unionism. Although Sid Hatfield had been acquitted of murder, he was later indicted on a separate charge of blowing up a mine temple. As he walked up the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse on his way to trial on August 1st, 1921, he was gunned down in broad daylight by C.E. Lively and a few other Baldwin Felts agents. Over 2,000 people attended Hatfield's funeral. For the miners to see their savior murdered so brazenly was devastating, and for many of them, it encapsulated all the injustice and oppression they had endured. Hatfield's death was really a turning point in the strike. The UMWA held a rally of 5,000 people in Charleston, where Frank Keeney urged those in attendance to fight to lift martial law and to free their imprisoned Union brethren in Mingo County. The miners got the message loud and clear. Governor Morgan had made it all too obvious that he wasn't going to do anything about the abuses taking place. South of Charleston, in the town of Marmet, the miners began to form their own army. Their mission was to march to Mingo County and free the jailed Union men. The problem was that to get there, they had to go through Logan County, the domain of Sheriff Chafin. UMWA President John Lewis and Mother Jones had serious concerns about the miners' plan. They believed this march to Mingo County would damage the UMW and the Union movement, and that many miners would lose their lives in the process. Jones went so far as to fake a telegram from U.S. President Warren G. Harding to try to get the miners to call this whole thing off. She went to Keeney at a union meeting with a folded piece of paper and told him it contained a message from the president saying if the miners stood down, he would help them achieve their demands. Keeney asked her to show him the telegram, and she obviously refused, acting offended and outraged that he wouldn't just take her word for it. This did not go over well, and everyone basically knew she was lying. Afterwards, Keeney and Mooney telegrammed the White House to confirm, and they were told the president had sent no such message to Mother Jones. She left West Virginia in disgrace that night. This was an odd blemish on her otherwise incredible career, but everyone's bound to make a stupid decision at some point. She was doing what she thought she had to do to protect the UMWA. I'll leave it at that. So the miners carried on with forming their army, and pretty soon 600 of them began marching towards Logan County, with more joining along the way. As August of 1921 wore on, the Miners' Army had grown by the thousands. As James Green writes, the nation had never witnessed such a large body of working men undertaking a militant action on such a massive scale. The Miners' March that summer was a huge general strike, as well as a massive political protest against the abuse of civil liberties by private employers and government officials. But this movement of nearly 10,000 armed miners amounted to something even more. By August 25th, it had become the largest civil insurrection the country had experienced since the Civil War. Many of the marchers had fought in World War I, and the whole affair was carried out in a very disciplined and military-like manner. The Miners' Army depended on many different allies. Supporters along the march route donated supplies and arms. Volunteers prepared hundreds of meals each day. And volunteer nurses with UMW on their hats even set up a makeshift hospital. And while Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney directed things from behind the scenes, the real leader on the ground was UMWA organizer Bill Blizzard. Blizzard began working at the age of 10, when he joined his father, a union man, in the coal mines. His mother was Sarah Blizzard, the aforementioned labor activist. Bill Blizzard was elected to a leadership position in UMWA District 17 when he was 19 years old. For its time, this was a radically diverse movement. The Miners' March included around 2,000 African Americans as well as many European immigrants. In a letter to the United Mine Workers Journal, a white miner wrote of the march, "I call it a darn solid mass of different colors and tribes blended together, woven, bound, interlocked, tongued and grooved and glued together in one body." Historian Charles Keeney, Frank Keeney's great-grandson, said in an interview that the marching miners did force restaurant owners and company facilities to desegregate in the area they controlled. And all of them, regardless of the color of their skin or their place of origin, sported red bandanas around their necks. The United Mine Workers of America had reappropriated the epithet redneck and the wearing of the red bandana to represent it in order to build a multiracial movement. The men of the Miners' Army wore these pieces of cloth on a practical level to distinguish themselves from their enemies, but also as a symbol of working class solidarity. While white sharecroppers in the South had earned this nickname by trying to distinguish themselves from African Americans, the UMWA miners adopted it for the opposite reason. They sought to minimize divisions and put the focus on their shared union identity. This whole time, Sheriff Chafin had been busy assembling his own militia. He enlisted 3,000 volunteer deputies to defend Logan against the Union horde. On August 26th, Keeney and Mooney were called to an emergency meeting with General Harry Bandholtz, a representative of the U.S. War Department who had been sent by President Harding. Bandholtz warned the Union leaders that if their men did not turn back, they would face the might of the U.S. military. This was enough for Keeney and Mooney, and they rushed to the front line to relay the message. The miners agreed to stand down, and Bill Blizzard arranged for trains to take them home. It looked like the Miners' Army would disperse. Just a day later, however, Sheriff Chafin decided to go after a group of miners who had harassed his deputies. He arrested 40 of them and killed 2 Union men in the process. This reignited the fire of the Redneck Army and rendered any truce null and void. Miners commandeered the very trains that had been sent to take them home and continued their journey to Logan. By August 28th, according to military intelligence officers, Union forces had taken de facto control of a 500-mile area from the Kanawha River to Logan County. An editorial in the Philadelphia Public Ledger lamented the situation in southern West Virginia. It called Mingo County a national stench and disgrace. Industrial disputes are one thing, it said, and armed revolt is another. It declared that this part of Appalachia needed some drastic re-civilizing. A columnist for the Baltimore Sun called West Virginia an engagingly barbarous commonwealth. At this point, the miners were fast approaching Chaffin's army of volunteer deputies. The sheriff's 3,000 men were lined up along the ridge of Blair Mountain, which formed a natural barrier between Union territory in Boone County and coal company turf in Logan County. On the evening of August 30th, a coal miner and Baptist minister named John Wilburn led a platoon of men on a reconnaissance mission up Spruce Fork Ridge of Blair Mountain. In the early morning of August 31st, they encountered a group of Chaffin's deputies. Each side asked the other for a secret password, and they quickly realized they were enemies. Gunfire erupted. A miner named Eli Kemp turned to run and was shot in the back by John Gore, Sheriff Chaffin's right-hand man. John Wilburn, the minister, then shot Gore in the head. The miners killed 2 of Chaffin's other deputies as well. This skirmish marked the beginning of the Battle of Blair Mountain. Much of the miners had been camped out in the nearby town of Blair. Columns of them started moving out and toward the mountain gaps along Spruce Fork Ridge. This was when the fighting began in earnest, and the Redneck Army faced Chaffin's army along the slopes of Blair Mountain. The battlefront stretched for miles, and the fighting was intense. On September 1st, miners on Spruce Fork Ridge saw 2 biplanes fly low over them, and explosions were heard. They realized they were being bombed. Sheriff Chaffin had rented these planes and equipped them with 2 kinds of homemade explosives: gas bombs that would cause extreme nausea, and pipe bombs filled with nuts, bolts, and black powder. Thankfully, they did not hit their targets, and no one was killed by them. The U.S. Secretary of War had ordered 2,100 U.S. Army infantrymen to be deployed to West Virginia. On September 2nd, General Bandholtz decided the fighting had gone far enough, and he ordered these federal troops into the combat zone. The miners, many of them being veterans, had no intention of fighting the federal government and surrendered. All in all, around 20 people had been killed in the battle, a surprisingly low number. Over the next few days, thousands of miners handed over their guns to the U.S. government. Many were actually glad at the arrival of federal troops. They, perhaps naively, thought the U.S. Army would step in on the side of the Union and bring justice. That was not on the agenda, however, and the military pulled out once the miners' army had been disarmed. Crazy, I know. The U.S. government stepping in on the side of big business? Unheard of. Hundreds of miners were arrested and indicted for murder and treason, including Frank Keeney, Fred Mooney, and Bill Blizzard. The 3 leaders were acquitted, however. Several rank-and-file marchers were the only ones to be convicted of treason and murder. Don Chaffin and his men all got off scot-free, and no Baldwin Felts agents were indicted. In the aftermath of the battle, the mine owners hired an evangelist preacher named Billy Sunday to go around West Virginia and propagandize for them. He said of the Redneck Army, "I cannot believe God had anything to do with the creation of these human buzzards," and proclaimed he would rather be in hell with John Wilkes Booth than here on earth with these human lice. Pressured into action by the Miners' March, the U.S. Coal Commission launched an investigation which found deplorable living conditions in the mining towns of West Virginia. This pushed the coal operators to continue the trend of welfare capitalism and make further improvements in sanitation, housing, recreation, healthcare, and education. The defeat at Blair Mountain really began the decline of the UMWA in West Virginia. The legal defense for the indicted miners had depleted the Union's funds. This draining of resources, the defeat of the Miners' March, and later the Great Depression all contributed to the Union's dwindling membership. Its numbers in the state diminished from around 50,000 in 1920 to less than 1,000 a decade later. It wasn't until 1933, when the New Deal granted workers the right to join a union and bargain collectively, that the UMWA made a resurgence in West Virginia. Although the Union had lost in this instance, the 1921 Miners' March and the Battle of Blair Mountain left a powerful legacy that continues to inspire activists and organizers to this day. Despite the shortcomings of the UMWA, this was one of the only institutions allowing interracial organizing and cooperation to take place at the time. An organization that banned discrimination and allowed different groups to come together and struggle was a rare light in the dark. It was really the best people had. Labor unions offer a unique outlet for people of all different backgrounds and worldviews to come together, put aside their differences, and fight for each other. And the very act of struggling together only builds more solidarity. People who want to protect the status quo have always attempted to divide the working class. They've used racism, xenophobia, nationalism, homophobia, transphobia to keep us distracted and fighting amongst ourselves while they laugh all the way to the bank. They want to keep us looking anywhere but at them. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. They tell us that if we're poor and miserable, if we can't get ahead, then it's because of non-white people or immigrants or whoever the scapegoat du jour is. If it wasn't for those people, the system would be working just great for us. They're terrified of the day when we realize the real enemies of all working people are the capitalists, the billionaires, and the politicians who serve them. We don't have to all agree on everything or even like each other. All we have to do is recognize that the entire working class, and I mean everyone, people of all ethnicities, skin colors, and religions, immigrants, documented and undocumented people, women, queer people, trans people, workers of other nations, all of us have common interests, and we should unite and work together to overturn this whole system. Anyway, that's what a true redneck would do. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give a like and subscribe. It helps me out a lot.